Thank you again, Dr. Yvonne, for offering this presentation for all of us. This session was originally, I was conceiving of it to look at the beginning of the 20th century, but it's been really helpful from your perspective with the growing, shifting nature of the manifestos over time, from patriarchal to non-hierarchical, if that's a way to say it. And it reflects to me a shift in, I became a UU in my teens, so not lifelong, but before my brain was finished forming. And I came into us at the Morristown UU Fellowship, which is historically very humanist. And I'm very theistic, but it was the ethics of community that lifted up for me. But it's interesting over the last 32 years, seeing the nature of how humanism is alive in our congregations. And what I would say is the wisdom of how people live into it was different in 1990 than it was in 2000 and is certainly today. What was your experience of that shifting, being a member of more than one church, right, congregation?
So, just to give a little hiccup in my my religious formation, as we talk about it in seminary, I grew up in a very thinking and activist home. My dad was a lifelong agnostic, he would call himself. My mom is mostly an atheist. And she's even uncomfortable with words like religious, but they joined Unitarian Church in Bellevue, Washington in the 1960s, before I was born. And I grew up in a UU, but they would have called it Unitarian household because that was still the vernacular. And I just didn't have an awareness of a religious space where you would talk about God. I did have Catholic friends and Baptist friends who would bring me to church, but I really didn't have an awareness of that. I did have an awareness of elders always who spoke reason and rationality. And in my 20s, I left because, how do you rebel against UU? You just become a non, right? And I came back into UU by visiting my parents' congregation, Granite Peak Unitarian Universalist in Prescott, Arizona. It's a very warm, very activist, and arguably non-theist congregation. And I just really saw how community works together. And it's something that I was trying to find in New York, and came to community church. And it's only through, really hard work of formation in seminary that I can now call myself a religious humanist instead of a secular humanist. And that is a lot of reading, and a lot of conversations with fellow humanists, and discovering that religion does not necessarily define as a belief in a deity. Religion means community. So a religious humanist is someone who is a part of the community. I am a member of UU. I am in UU seminary. Therefore, I am a religious humanist. I no longer self-define as atheist because I feel it's a non-thing. Do I believe in a deity? No. Am I agnostic? No. But I have a classmate that refers to being himself as a non-theist. So I would guess that would be a way to talk about that. But, to circle back around to your question, I know I'm taking a long time answering it. Sorry about that. There have always been very caring, but also deeply intellectual elders in UU that I had access to, my parents and their friends, and not all white people either, for those who might be thinking that. And that really led me into my long academic life, which I felt was somewhat limited because even though deep thinking was happening and intellectualism was happening, it wasn't really connecting with my activist life. So for
Mm.
me, a part of being a religious humanist is and when we're asked to define what our vision is for our ministry, is to build that bridge to the secular world, to actually be in conversation with secular humanists and with people who might not even know that they are secular humanists, you know, the people who care, the people who do the boots on the ground activism, the people who organize the food pantries, and the people who do the marching, and to actually be a space and place where they can come into community, so they can feel that community that I've felt in various UU settings in this country. As someone who wasn't always sure what I believed in, I knew what I didn't believe in. And I think that's an important part of UU is the depth and breadth of our ability to be in covenant with people who have different faiths, who have different faith traditions. And again, always I will bring it back to that core of do no harm and also do good. You know, it can't just be this inactive do no harm, but do good in the world and do good for ourselves through that. So that for me, if I had a humanist manifesto, it'd be that short. It'd be that encapsulated. So
It's interesting. Some of the things you said remind me of what worked for me well when I became a UU. I was raised in a progressive blue collar Catholic household, and I never felt like I left the church. I felt like the church left me when in a year's time, our progressive priests were replaced with conservatives, and all of a sudden the message was different on Sunday. So I had to leave. And when I found UU in Morristown, the fellowship, even though it was probably the most atheist fellowship at the time I could imagine, the ethic was the same ethic I was used to. And so they would say community or beloved community, and I would hear body of Christ. And I said, okay, I can do this. This is the same spirituality. This is how I was raised, and that works for me. And I also appreciated how you mentioned that you wouldn't call yourself an atheist. It's I should have said this earlier, but there's only so much you can say in a 1 hour session.
yeah.
And I don't remember if it's Dietrich, Rees, or Potter, but one of them famously said, who was one of the founding, preachers of humanism,
Mhm.
I don't identify as an atheist because that's a faith statement. I can't say yes or no.
Yeah.
And it's very similar to what you just said now, 100 years later,
Yeah.
literally 100 years later.
And it's also the idea of defining yourself in a negative, it's like saying, I'm not a racist. It's like, no, it's, I'm not a believer in your God. Why define myself? I can, openly say I am someone who works to smash the patriarchy and dismantle white supremacy and decenter whiteness. And for me, a lot of my humanism derives from that goal, that internal drive. And, I think there are spaces and places where faith communities can really participate in white supremacy. And I think it's important to also acknowledge, wow, I went dark really fast, but there are spaces and places where humanism, particularly some humanists in UU, have participated in white supremacy. And I think, if I have to be there with my fellow seminarians, like having a banner that I would champion, and that's reclaim humanism for the humanists. And I would say that anyone who's not in right relation in the larger community, and that means everybody, is not actually living their humanist faith or their humanist belief. Because again, some humanists won't use the term faith. And language is important, it is. You had talked about some things that I was madly taking notes. Wisdom, vision, responsibility, accountability, center ourselves, and love and justice. And you're talking about Rees, but you're also talking about a lot of the other humanist leaders, men, women, and however they want to define themselves. And it's that internal view of compassion I think compassion for the entire world. And I had someone ask me this question. She's self-identifies as a pagan and an animist. I'm an animal rights person. I'm an ethical vegan. And she said, well, if you're a humanist, doesn't that mean that you have a hierarchy of humans above animals? No. It's a part of my humanism is the actual, digging deep and finding where that principle that we have, the interdependent web of all existence. There's a lot of environmental activism in humanist texts and humanist belief. It's not just about making the world better for people. It's, essential, and it is essential for humanity that we care for the rest of the planet, the rest of, it's my compassion is so interwoven in compassion for my environment. That's a part of who we are as humans. That's kind of expanding beyond, but I think that it's important to, again, you had talked about you as a living faith. Humanism is a living, it's a living thing. It's a living, breathing way of being in the world, as is evidenced by that need for certain religious leaders in UU to codify in the Humanist Manifesto 1, Manifesto 2, Manifesto 3. I think those documents can be very helpful, but I'm also always a little bit amused at this need for people who often reject what they would see as the trappings of religion and sacred texts and all the rest of it, to have to create their own sacred text, because that's really what those are. They are sacred texts to humanists. And it's that idea of needing to have a definition. And I'm sure some of it comes out of, the 1930s, when you have Marx writing his, you have the, Marxism, and you have all the rest of these pamphlets coming out and all the rest of these big statements about how the world works and systems and all of that. But it's also that idea that we need to have a text in which to center ourselves. I would say rather we need to have action in which to center ourselves. And we come together in service on a Sunday or Saturday or whenever we meet. But I guess it's more for the outside world, maybe. Maybe I see the manifestos as more for other people to understand what it is I believe. I mean, I would hope that it's evidenced in my action and way of being in the world, what I believe.
It's almost like a humanist version of, in Hinduism, karma yoga. Your prayer is action, and that's a interesting way of thinking about it. Definitions, faith and theology. I remember I've talked about this before from the pulpit, but I don't know if I've said it on the podcast yet. But it's he's recently passed, but Professor Dr. James Cone, who's essentially the founder of liberation theology, would say, and theologically, I mean, he was progressive, but I would say theologically conservative. That may not be quite the right label because he's a liberation theologian, but no one would say he was not a prominent Christian thinker, is a better way to say it. And he would define theology as how we make and understand meaning in the world. And that's what all of this is, all these manifestos, these sacred texts. And there's a, I think that with the rise of UU lectionaries, so to speak, we're not actually calling them that, but Wellspring or Soul Matters or Touchstones, they're all ways of, I think it's something like at least 30% of our congregations are working off of one of those 3 or 4 bodies of work. And some of it's practical. It is a lot easier to put a service together if you've got a lectionary, but it's also a theological statement to create a set of materials that everyone's being taught. And it's certainly happening with the Tapestry of Faith program, which has been around now for 15 years, 17 years,
Mm.
and it's been expanding, at least from the educators. Those of us that are educators, many of us have learned all of those stories from heart because we tell them on a Sunday morning. And so all of a sudden we have created this narrative, shared narrative that our kids are raised on. And what does that mean when they're adults? If our adults haven't, it's off the topic, but if our adults haven't heard the stories,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it comes into in a slightly different topic, but we're talking about polity and individual congregational polity. And it's a conversation that I often have in depth with my very deep thinking 89-year-old mother about, how much, because she has issue with things like beloved and dear ones and language that's coming out of the seminary. And I said, if you think back to where beloved community comes from, it doesn't have to be a rejection of humanism. It's not in contestation with humanism, because religious humanists are building a community. That's what we do. And that's what we do in UU. And to acknowledge that as a beloved community and to want to expand that beloved community is not, because she reads it as very Christian, which for her is hard. It's difficult. It's something that she left and doesn't want to be part of. My understanding of it is it's an expansion. It's beloved. It's the core of humanism is that we love humanity. And there are some that are very difficult to love. This is true. There are some humans who are difficult to love. But if we are in right relationship with each other, which is what we're supposed to be in UU, in any congregation, then why not call ourselves dear ones? Why not be beloved community? And I do think it might also be a generational thing that words have more power in an older we use dear and babe and things like that, not indiscriminately, but also it's not as private as it might be for someone who's older. But, thinking about the centralization, which is what I'm seeing all of these things like Wellspring, it's like a centralization of knowledge and teaching. That in some ways for some UUs might be seen as in conflict with the idea of individual congregational polity, that they don't want messages coming down from a centered place. Like, they're not telling you what to think, they're giving you tools. Just like the humanist manifestos are not telling you you have to believe this or you are not a humanist. They are giving you their definitions, the people who signed on to it. And all over the American Humanist Association's website says you do not have to believe this. But this is what we in conversation have agreed humanism is about. And I think that's an essential thing that comes into what it means to be UU as well, which is why I see humanism and UU as very much in relationship with each other. So, and I'm cognizant of the time, so I'm gonna.
With that, we have about 7 more minutes, and I'm gonna put in the chat, and then when people that watch us later, we'll see these reflection questions on a PowerPoint slide. And for folks that are watching this later from home, or if you're watching this in a class in one of your congregations, you'll be able to pause on that slide. Feel free and discuss amongst yourselves and however you're doing it, wherever you are later. The questions I'm going to say out loud right now are: do you, anyone in this group or groups watching this later, see the ways that UU and humanism have developed in alignment? What are some of the differences between your congregation's understanding of our principles and the statements in the Humanist Manifesto number 3? And how do you define humanism? Is your understanding different from what is presented? Because, again, we're not telling you what to believe. We're just teaching our history. And people can look at it in different ways. Do you know anyone who is a secular humanist? How about a religious humanist? And how do you define the difference? And are all humanists necessarily atheist? And for folks tuning in, our next session will be on Antifa theology. We'll be looking at the 30s through the 60s, more or less, and a heavy dose of James Luther Adams, who I've read every one of his pieces of writing, and the beginning of anti-fascist movements, and what taking covenantal theology up to the next step. So we'll be backtracking time-wise, and then moving forward from there. And you'll see us do this differently each time, just trying to make sense of how do we look at a certain time period. You can't just look at the actual time period. You just sometimes have to look a little bit before and a little bit after for historical context. Great to be with you all, and I'll see you next time, and I'll see some of you today at church.